a lake. I mean, so it is very granular. We're talking kind of big, bold definitions and how it's going to implement and everything. But basically, it's about homeowners, construction folks, farmers. It's the basic parts of our different states that are most deeply affected. So I think I'm out of time, and I'll turn it back to you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks for those questions. Next, Senator Cramer, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, Senator Capito, and to all of our witnesses. I do think you're right. We are sort of arguing two things here. You're arguing the science and the effects. You're arguing the law and the Constitution. For those of us that want to go back and forward 7 generations, my 6th great-grandfather gave his life at Bunker Hill for the cause of liberty. And I believe if we're going to use broad definitions, that would be for the cause of federalism, not an insignificant issue that we should ignore for the science. But I want to ask you, Ms. Bodine, because earlier this year in this committee, Lieutenant General Spellman, the head of the Corps of Engineers, testified. I gasped when he said it. He said it rather casually in the context of workforce. He said that the Corps of Engineers has considers about 80 federal issues a year, decisions, 80,000 federal decisions per year. Do you believe that if there's 80,000 regulatory actions by the Corps of Engineers, that the clarification, the simplification of SACIT should reduce that workload for the Corps of Engineers, and perhaps there's some efficiency that we could actually gain from this?
Unfortunately, I don't think we're going to see that, because the way they set it up, it is going to be case-by-case determinations instead of bright definitions.
Thank you. And that's my concern. It's like, how much simpler could they make it? And how much more prescriptive could they have been? And I suppose you could say we could be more prescriptive if we changed the Clean Water Act to the Navigable Waters Act, but we don't call the Endangered Species Act the Every Species Act. Definition, titles are one thing, definitions another thing. I want to ask you about permitting reform. Senator Capito referenced the importance of it. A lot of us on all sides of the issue are concerned about and want some permitting reform. And one of the things that I've emphasized throughout this debate is it's become just as difficult to permit a wind farm or a solar farm, panel farm, or a transmission line as it is a fuels pipeline of some sort. And transmission lines and pipelines, and for that matter, interstate highways, are long linear, right? Long linear, often, almost always, multi-state, multi-jurisdictional infrastructure. And because of the complexity of this type of infrastructure, Congress established the nationwide permit program to allow these projects to obtain one permit as long as they're determined to have a minimal effect on the environment. Can you discuss the importance of a nationwide permit and maybe also considering both the efficiency of it as well as the effectiveness, I guess, of a nationwide permit?
Yeah, the Corps of Engineers nationwide permits is really the reason why we haven't completely stopped building infrastructure in this country, because it is a more efficient and truncated review based on minimal impacts. There has been a gradual narrowing of the nationwide permits, which means that more and more would be subject to the individual permits, which are what take years and years and years and subject of lawsuits. If there isn't federal jurisdiction, then you don't need to get the nationwide permit. But that question is going to be decided case by case, and it remains to be seen how that'll be applied.
It's hard for me as a former regulator to imagine a multi-state, multi-jurisdictional linear infrastructure that doesn't have a federal nexus somewhere along the line, right? I mean,
Yeah.
So it seemed to me that, anyway, that said, I think it's another part of the discussion I think we ought to get back to. Let me ask, where do you see the legal fight coming? I mean, obviously, if 2.5 pages of amendments to a 141-page rule in the context of a major Supreme Court decision isn't going to be adequate. Certainly not adequate for the Prairie Pothole region that I come from. And by the way, with all due respect, not federally protected does not mean not protected. In fact, I would submit that the mediocrity of the federal government is far, far worse for the protection of wetlands in North Dakota than what North Dakotans, and for that matter, what farmers, how they protect their own wetlands. But where do you see the legal fight coming in the next several months?
Well, I think And again, I'm not representing anybody
I
in this.
understand.
But what I have read and heard is that, yes, there are groups that are going to challenge the September conforming rule based on both the issue of no notice and comment as well as the substance. And then the litigation over the January rule is ongoing. I said that's why it's not in effect. That's why it stayed in 26 states, and that litigation will go on. So yes, there'll still be litigation.
Well, let's face it, I mean, as long as there's chaos and uncertainty, there's going to be litigation and stays, and maybe that's a strategy in and of itself. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. We've been joined by Senator Markley, and if you'd like to jump in, you're next in line. And thanks for
Thank you
joining
very
us.
much, Mr. Chairman.
And after you, if nobody else shows up, Senator Mullen, you'd be next. And then Senator Bozeman.
So, Dr. Sullivan, it's well established the connection between wetlands and the nesting and feeding habits of 50% of North American birds, 31% of plant species. They just play a vital role in so many ways. I wanted to ask you, though, about a particular angle, and that is related to whether the loss of protection for wetlands impacts tribal communities. The wetlands are critical to sustain fish species, like the various protected species in Klamath Basin in Oregon, culturally significant plants and first foods. Are some of these vital ecological and culture functions in jeopardy? And how will SACIT affect tribes across the country?
Thank you, Senator Merkley. Yeah, so this is a critical issue, one which I work with many tribal partners myself, addressing these sorts of questions. So I think we probably need to back up a step to fully understand the situation. One is, the key piece is that for the dispossession of land, we entered into the trust responsibility with the tribes, and part of that trust responsibility was to protect natural resources, including water. And that's a really critical piece, that we have a burden of responsibility to protect water as well as other natural resources. The other piece of this is, and it's clear to understand, that we have a duty to protect tribal rights and resources that we don't shoulder with every other group. And although this was initially meant to serve as a protectorate role, that trust responsibility has morphed today into federal authority that is considered plenary. And the reason that's important is the combination of limited tribal authority and plenary federal authority has caused tribes to rely heavily on federal environmental legislation rather than their inherent sovereignty for environmental protections within tribal lands. So that's one point I want to make. The other is that despite the trust responsibility, many tribes have found that federal protection of waters is insufficient, has been inadequate in providing sufficient protection, leading to impaired water quality, largely because of the TAS provisions, which is treatment as a state. And I want to make a point here. As of 2018, only 54 of the roughly 330 federally recognized tribes that meet TAS eligibility requirements had received TAS status, and only 44 of those had their water quality standards approved by the EPA. So this leads us to a situation where tribes are in limbo a little bit in terms of protecting water. To your point, these waters are critical. And I showed a map earlier of ephemeral streams across multiple reservations. Those were mapping that we did using the most advanced techniques to map ephemeral streams. Ephemeral streams and wetlands are critical for many tribal nations for a suite of different purposes, ranging from subsistence purposes, hunting, fishing, and gathering, to spiritual purposes. A couple specific examples I could give is camas is a critical plant in the western United States and in the Northwest. Where does it grow? It grows in areas around ephemeral streams. It grows in seasonal wetlands. These have been long-standing subsistence plants that are central to many tribal cultures, cultural practices, and subsistence. So that's an example where those waters then lose protection. Another point that I really want to make, and this is critical, is on many reservations due to the Allotment Act, the Dawes Act, which was essentially that even within reservation land, non-Indians were allowed to come in and purchase land. So that patchwork of jurisdiction on the reservations makes it very hard for the tribes to do this themselves, and they need the Clean Water Act protections to protect those critical systems. So I think it's a critically important piece. I'm actually working right now with the Coeur d'Alene tribe where we're looking at wetlands and restoring wetlands to actually combat drought on the reservation. So critical question, absolute need for a consistent protection at the federal level for wetlands, ephemeral streams, to protect multiple uses, beneficial uses for tribes.
Yeah, thank you very much. And my time's up, so I'll just close with a comment, which is in Oregon we've experienced intense droughts over the last few years, and so there's a lot more attention to the role of groundwater. Many ranchers starting to ask for oversight of the control of groundwater for that reason, because if the level drops too low, you're in trouble. But it's also drawn attention to the connection of the groundwater filtering and effect on cooling in terms of algae in the lakes and other factors, whether or not it's connected by surface water. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.